Okay, so I guess we'll start with the proceedings now. I know people are still kind of coming in. Welcome everyone. My name is Erin, the founder and national convener for the Asian Australian Alliance and co-author of the COVID-19 Racism Incident Report for Australia. We want to thank everybody for joining us this afternoon to evening for those in North America, and good morning to those in Australia, and happy Saturday, and I guess other parts of the Asia Pacific joining us today. Our webinar is titled COVID-19 Racism, Impacts on the Diaspora, Australia, US and Canada, where our panelists who are from Australia, US and Canada will be discussing COVID-19 racism and how this has impacted on our respective Asian communities. But before we start, I would like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the lands we are all joining from today and meeting on today, and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. I extend that respect to all the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who may be joining as attendees today on our webinar. Just a little message to the panelists. If you guys would like to state or talk about, you know, your the Indigenous land that you guys are meeting on today, feel free to. Anybody? Adri, do you want to mention about Sydney and Melina, Melbourne?
Sure. Yes, I'm from I'm meeting on the lands of the ordinary people of the Kulin Nation, and I want to pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Thank you.
I'm zooming in from Sydney, so I pay my respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and welcome any Indigenous people and elders joining us today.
Good morning, everyone. I'm currently in San Francisco and Oakland and want to acknowledge Ohlone land.
Hello, I'm joining in from the unceded, ancestral, and traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples on a land colonially known as Vancouver, Canada. I'll also take the opportunity to thank all the Indigenous communities and leaders who've labored and pushed forward the racial justice movement, making it possible for us to be here to even talk about anti-Asian racism today. Thank you.
Great. So just very quickly before we start, just a bit of housekeeping. So we do have two admins today. If they're willing to, I'd like them to put on their video and say hello. Our Asian Australian Alliance conveners, Cindy Shung and Sarah Lin. I don't know if you guys want to just quickly say hi, unmute yourself and say hi.
Hi, I'm Cindy. I'm actually, I live in Sydney, Australia, so I'm one of the Asian Australian Alliance conveners, and I'm helping today's question to collect questions for the post.
Yep. And Sarah, you want to say a quick hello?
Hi guys, I'm Sarah. I'm a student at Macquarie University, and I'm involved in the Asian Australian Alliance. So today I'll just be helping to admin.
Great. I guess after my part, I'll also be doing part of the adminning, and you know, we'll be kind of watching the chat box. So feel free to put your questions in the chat box or actually do an actual Q&A. And for those who are watching via Facebook Live, you can also put questions under the live stream video, and we will also check that. So we may not be able to get to all the questions, but if your question is burning and it's directed to a panelist in particular, we're happy to, hopefully the panelists will be happy to kind of answer them through email or by other means. So we want to make sure that, you know, if you don't get to ask your question on this webinar, you'll still be able to get an answer to your question. Great. So just a bit of introduction. So today our panelists will be discussing a number of topics around COVID-19 racism, compare similarities between the diasporas, talk about what anti-Asian racism means, as well as do some media and social media analysis, among many other topics. Just a little bit of quick background, just very quickly. The idea of the webinar was born out of a number of emails and Zoom video conferences. And I want to acknowledge one of our Asian Australian Alliance academics convener, Dr. Osmond Chiu, for doing the initial introductions to Russell. And that's how, from Stop AAPI Hate. And that's how we kind of started this idea, and it just grew from there. So today, our moderator is one of our New South Wales conveners for the Asian Australian Alliance, Adri Lozano, and our panelists include Melina Astana, who's our head Victorian convener for the Asian Australian Alliance and National Vice President of the Asian Australian Lawyers Association. Osmond Chiu, who's a research fellow at the Per Capita Thinktank. Dr. Russell Jung from the Stop AAPI Hate campaign and Professor of Asian American Studies at San Francisco State University. Telly Wong from the Asian American Social Media Campaign, #WashTheHate, and Senior Vice President and Chief Content Officer for the IW Group. And finally, Ellen from Canada, from Project 1907 and the Eliminate Hate campaign in Canada. I also want to kind of make a few acknowledgements quickly of just some guests that are actually attendees. And I'd like to mention we have Tien Q, who is an MLC from Victoria. We should also be having Jihad Dib, who is from the New South Wales Parliament in Australia. Jenny Leong MP, who is the state member for Newtown. And I believe we may be also joined by Tai Ma, who is an actor from Mulan and The Farewell. And I also believe we have Vivian Nguyen, who's the chairperson of the Victorian Multicultural Council. So that's pretty much the end of my part. I know you're probably tired of listening, to me talk. So I will pass on the wand to our moderator for the session, Adri Lozano. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Erin. And I know we have a lot to get through today, so we'll get right into it. First, I'd like to call on Melina, who is our Victorian convener for Asian Australian Alliance. Many of you might have joined our previous webinars and have heard about our results about the survey to date. Melina, could you talk us through what the top line results have been, the key takeaways that are driving our campaign, and for anybody who doesn't have a background to what's going on, what the key objectives were in creating the survey for us?
Thank you, Adri. I think our previous seminar, we've had 2 seminars so far. The first one was all about racism, where we talked about everything related to racism in Australia, what it is, who to report, the media rhetoric, and some details of our survey, which our survey was launched in April earlier this year to report on COVID-19 related racism in Australia. And we were obviously influenced by the American campaign, AAPI Hate campaign as well, to start that. And we collected about 400 reports, probably more now, and we released our preliminary report in August, a little bit earlier this year. And some of the findings were that over 65% of the respondents identified as female. New South Wales recorded the most reports at 37%, Victoria recorded the second highest with 32%, and Queensland recorded the third highest, which is 13%. Almost 60% of the incidents involved physical or verbal harassment, which is racial slurs, name calling, physical intimidation, verbal threats, getting spat at. The most common type of racism experienced, which was 35%, was in the form of racial slurs or name calling. 40% of the COVID-19 related racism incidents happened on a public street or on the sidewalk. 22% of the incidents happened in a supermarket. 9.4% of the incidents reported happened online, with 43% of these online incidents happening on Facebook. More than 84% of the perpetrators were unknown to the respondents. 15% of the respondents identified themselves as international students, of whom 80% were from China. As you can note, there was a very high number of reported incidents of racism. However, this is just at the tip of the iceberg, as many go unreported. The most disturbing aspect of the report is that over 90% of the respondents did not report the incident to the police or any other authority like the Victorian Human Rights or Equal Opportunities Commission here, or the anti-discriminatory body in New South Wales, or the Human Rights Commission. It will be interesting to see whether the statistics are similar for the US or Canada when we talk about this further. I just want to give you a couple of examples of the kind of incidents that were reported. So just by way of example, a female 19 Vietnamese Australian reported, "I was told to stay away from them because I'm Asian, so I have coronavirus. Told that it was my people who brought the virus over here. Attempted to kick me, called me an Asian slut and an Asian dog. Told me to go eat a bat. Threatened me with a knife, spat in my face, getting spit in my left eye." In another incident, male 46, Chinese Indian Australian reported, "A colleague who I did not meet before asked if I knew what COVID-19 COVID was. I said, yes, it's the virus. Then he jokingly asked if I knew what CCP was. I said, I don't know. Then I was told I'm Chinese. I should know, as it stood for Chinese Communist Party. I replied, what is it got to do with me, as I'm mixed Chinese, Indian Chinese, and now Australian. So these are the kind of incidents that were reported. With our report, we also had a call for action, which if we have time, I can discuss a bit later. And we are now trying to see what we can do to educate people on where to report and what redressal they can get, and how we can look at this problem overall in Australia to have a national policy in relation to this as well. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Melina. Before we go to the international results and see what the similarities and differences there, we have an interesting question from the audience that asks, given the length of time that the survey has been live, are we seeing any increasing vitriol? So Melina or Osmond, do you want to speak to that very briefly before we go to Russell?
Osmond might be able to answer that better, the change in the kind of numbers, if there is, or maybe Erin might have those current details.
I mean, I guess one of the challenges is because this is a community-run survey, we have been very reliant on individuals knowing about the survey. So I think we're not pretending this is any kind of academic survey. And obviously, you know, when we first released it, we got many more, I guess the sort of scale of responses were much greater, just because it was the first time anyone had really done any work collecting this data. So I guess that's one thing that needs to be done to get a better sense of tracking how it's changed. And I think getting better data from, you know, authorities and better data collection more generally is something that needs to be prioritized.
Thanks, Osmond. So to recap all of that, basically we had an influx of results on the back of the release of the survey initially, and with the changing tide of the media and the climate in Australia, we've seen ebbs and flows over time with the number of results and the areas from which the reports have been coming from. You'll see that there are more results coming from Victoria and New South Wales, and we might say that that might be because there's just a larger population in those areas. But we're certainly looking at the trends over time. We've released a preliminary report on the results, which you can see on the Asian Australian Alliance website, and we with a little bit more time and a responses so that we can see if there is a trend. We're also collaborating with organisations all around Australia. One of the key problems in Australia is that the collection of data isn't centralised, so different kinds of racism is being reported in different channels, and it's really difficult at the moment to have one centralised place, and that's something that Asian Australian Alliance is working towards.
But
now I think it would be...
I might just add quickly to the
Melina.
survey, just to that point, because it's relevant. The new reports that have come out in Victoria have also related to the second wave of COVID-19, and there's a different group that has been blamed for that. So a lot of South Asians or people from Muslim backgrounds and others who have been blamed for the second wave of COVID-19 in Victoria. And so we've seen different kinds of reports, though not all of them have been reported. So we're also launching a South Asian campaign to record those kind of incidents as well of COVID-19 related racism, which are not necessarily targeted towards East Asians or people of Chinese heritage, but other Asians who other people who have been targeted as well.
I think that is a very important point. I think a lot of people assume that the COVID-related racism is targeted only at East Asian people, but it is true that people of Asian backgrounds from various ethnicities are being targeted by the racism as well. On that note, I might ask Russell to unmute himself and perhaps speak to the international experience. So looking at the data that's been collected in the US and in Canada, and talk about the differences and similarities there with the Australian campaign.
Okay, thanks, Adri. And thanks to the Australian Asian Alliance for hosting this and organizing it, especially Professor Chia, who networked all of us. And what's been clear as we compare the international data is that we have real common types of racism and maybe common sources of the racism. And I'd like to highlight a couple. First of all, most of the incidents, at least in the US, aren't considered hate crimes where you could be arrested for. And that's why people aren't necessarily calling the police, but they're called in the US hate incidents. So they're cases of verbal harassment or being shunned. And like Melina shared, this harassment isn't like slight microaggressions. They're really terrible taunts with racial slurs, a lot of nativistic sentiment, a lot of anti-Chinese sentiment. Like Canada, we in the US found that women are harassed more than men at the 2-to-1 rate, and so it'd be interesting to hear if Canada has that same trend. We're going to come up with a women's report because of that sort of intersectional oppression that women are facing. In the US, we're seeing a lot of civil rights violations of being displaced, getting mistreated at the workplace, or getting barred from establishments. I saw that a lot in the news globally, that restaurants were banning Chinese or Chinese tourists, and this civil rights approach of trying to enforce safe access to goods and services is going to be a policy that I'll talk about later. We do, and then again, what's common among all the nations is that we are facing high levels of physical assault. Canada twice as much as the US and Australia, and high levels of being coughed and spat upon. So this was so noticeable early on that we created a special category of being coughed and spat upon. My own wife was running and someone blocked her path and purposely coughed on her. And it's just a debasing, dehumanizing way of treating people. I think people are doing that because they think we're the ones infecting them, and so they want to reinfect us, or they're just using this sort of physical response to the virus in this way. And then we have high rates of being pushed and shoved. The US has more shunning, and maybe Americans or Asian Americans are reporting it more because they really dislike that social isolation. And I think maybe the other countries may just overlook and don't think it's worth reporting, but at least in the United States, because a lot of the incidents occur on public transit, and it's pretty noticeable deliberate avoidance of Asians, at least in the US, people are reporting it. So I will stop here. I would say in terms of trends, again, vulnerable populations, elderly, children, and women whom people perceive are vulnerable are being attacked. It's in the US, it's mostly East Asian, 60% are non-Chinese, 40% are Chinese. And we did see the spike after Trump began using the term coronavirus. And for us in the United States, the president's political rhetoric really has been inflaming racism, giving people a license. And now that he's got and contracted COVID-19, we already have a senator saying China is to blame for the president getting infected, that China is poisoning the president. And so that we will see could lead to higher rates of violence and racism. Second, I guess one last point is not only are we, the historical trend is not only do we face interpersonal violence, but in the US, we're always met as Asians with racist policies. So COVID-19 has been used to, as an excuse for an immigration ban in the US, for a ban of Chinese STEM students, and a ban of WeChat. So again, diseases are used as a reasoning or a rationale to institute racist policies.
Thanks, Russell. That was really interesting to see the overlaps there. If I could ask all the panelists to unmute themselves. Russell touched on a couple of interesting points about how we got to this place. So what the rhetoric was in the United States, what the current political and social context is, and it would be interesting to hear from the panelists about their individual contexts and what they feel were some key influences in contributing to the racism in the respective countries. Could we perhaps start with Telly?
Yeah, hi, thanks for having me. I didn't get the full question. You froze up a little bit, but I think I got the gist of it. I think here, I'm from New York. I grew up here, and there's always been a lot of racial tension towards the Asian community here. So it's nothing new. And in the late 80s and 90s, there were a string of violent attacks on Chinese food delivery men that were happening across the city for a number of years, and they still continue. As well as also tensions in inner cities with small businesses, Chinese-owned and Korean-owned, with other communities of color. So I think the tension's always been there, but I think with the coronavirus and the pandemic, that's really sort of emboldened a lot of people who might already have these prejudices to really act out on them now.
Thank you. There was actually a question that you already answered, that whether the panelists felt that COVID-19 was just a convenient excuse to be overtly racist towards Asians for those who already harbor racist feelings. So perhaps we can go to Ellen, Molina, or Osmond to speak to that, and whether that is something that exists in their environments.
Yeah, I'm happy to take that question. I guess the way I see it is there seems to be a bit of a fusion of a few different strands. So there's the kind of local historical context, as well as this debate about the relationship with China. So, you know, Australia, like, you know, Canada and the United States, has a history of anti-Chinese racism going back to the 19th century. Australia instituted anti-Chinese legislation, restrictive immigration practices. But I think, and we also seen some of the narratives that influenced that in the 19th century re-emerge in this discussion about COVID, particularly around hygiene and disease. So that was one of the big narratives in when talking about Chinese migration in the 19th century. But I think particularly in the Australian context, what makes it slightly different to, I think, Canada and the US is that the idea of Australia and Australian values was specifically constructed against an imagined Chinese other. And I think that kind of has always really existed, even as Australia has moved away from white Australia. And I think particularly over the last few years, what's really added to that has been this changing discussion about China. So particularly over probably the last 2-3 years, there's been a real shift in how people see China. It's increasingly being seen as a threat, economically and militarily. And there's even this sense that if in Australia, amongst some people, that Australia is on the front line of a conflict with China. I think particularly we've seen that really come out over the last year. My sense is that in a domestic context in Australia, questions around foreign interference, but also there's been a domestic angle to it, questions about corruption and donations, the loyalty of MPs, but also I think what's going on in Hong Kong has really supercharged this sense of China as a threat, and that's all really come together right now. So it's been a bit of a toxic mix of a few different factors: historical, geopolitical, as well as the virus coming together. And so sometimes the lines between them aren't really clear. And what it's also meant that it's much more difficult to talk about this issue of COVID-related racism, particularly because of this geopolitical element and this view that to even talk about it is giving credence to the Chinese Communist Party. So it sort of made this discussion much harder to have, and there is almost a reflexive pushback by some people whenever this is raised, because there's a sense that, oh, hey, there's a much greater threat, and if you do this, you're helping our perceived enemy.
Thank you, Osmond. I think that was a fantastic summary on the different influences on the current climate. I'd be interested to hear from Ellen in Canada to hear whether that is shared over there, and if there are any unique influences to the Canadian experience.
Sure. I always say, there's a quote by a journalist, her name is Denise Balkasoon, and she says, "Endless surprise at racism is one of the most racist things about Canada." And I think that really sums up where Canadians are at when we're having a conversation about racism. Even the data that Russell just presented, within the group, there was shock, oh, I thought Canada was supposedly a peace-loving nation, or I thought Canadians were so nice, when actually we're seeing that incidents of violence and assault are significant in Canada. I can speak to the experience of being in Vancouver, where racism against Asian people, particularly East Asians, is incredibly normalized. There is a lot of gaslighting, particularly around anti-Asian racism, where it's often not even considered to be quote unquote real or is justified because of the rhetoric, particularly around foreign home ownership. And for example, the perception that there are droves of Chinese people coming to buy up all the land in Vancouver. So the real estate has definitely also played a role in the racism that results here. As was already touched upon, we have a long history of anti-Asian racism, particularly in BC. The province is founded on racist policy, particularly toward Chinese and Japanese people. So there's, so many examples of legislation and racist policy: the Opium Act, the Continuous Journey Act, the Dominion Elections Act, the Chinese Exclusion Act. There was even a Chinese barbecue meat ban. All of this has been sitting under the surface and bubbling. And when a leader like Trump, or someone that has that much global influence comes out and uses racist language like the China virus, it gives permission for everyone else to use it too. So I wouldn't say this is new. There's a long history and it's been bubbling under the surface. But definitely with the onset of COVID and then seeing political leaders using such racist language, there's been a huge spike in violence and fear that communities, particularly East Asian communities, are experiencing here.
Fantastic.
Can I add to that as well on Ellen's point of what was said in the US and why the president was picked up in other places as well. It was picked up in Australia by mainstream media as again, it was called the Chinese virus, and these kind of narratives obviously influence the behavior of people. And it's and our racism in Australia obviously started with the White Australia policy and has continued, but it has seen a spate of different kinds of racist incidents against different communities. So you would probably, I'm not sure if everyone's aware, but people from Australia might be, but there have been a spate of incidents against South Asians at a particular time because of certain reasons. Then the African community was targeted as African gangs just very recently, a couple of years ago. So it's a part of a larger problem that we have in Australia as well. These kind of incidents obviously precipitate that kind of behavior and make it justify people behaving in a certain manner, and that's what is quite disturbing. And I think that narrative around the world does influence what's happening here as well. Thanks.
Fantastic. On that note, then, we have an interesting question from Tien Q from Melbourne. Are any of the groups reporting racist incidents between different Asian groups in a systematic way at all? So I know, Melina, you're starting to do some work in the South Asian space. Could you speak a little bit to that? And if any other groups are doing segmented reporting, could you also speak to that?
Yeah, so with our initial COVID-19 report, it's not segmented in terms of, which different Asian groups have been targeted, but we do ask them the information if they're willing to provide that on what's the ethnicity. So we do have some data in relation to which ethnicities have been targeted, but we do know, especially in Victoria, that the South Asians are targeted as well. There's a few media reports on that. So we are launching a South Asian racism survey separately, just to note, sort of figure out what are the reasons for that kind of racism, whether it's related to COVID-19 or they're quite separate from that, or whether it's partly related to that and there's other factors that influence it as well. So we will potentially have that data by the end of the year or early next year as well. If there's any other organization that's doing that, it'll be great to kind of connect with them and see whether there's any synergies in our work. So I'd be very keen to know if anyone from in our audience is doing that kind of work. Thank you. Sorry, and I must add that different organizations within states, I say VMC here, Victorian Multicultural Commission, or the Victorian Human Rights and Equal Opportunities Commission, may have some data in relation to that as well, because they're doing some work. Anti-discriminatory body in New South Wales may also have some data, and there's some collected by the Australian Human Rights Commission. And we are in touch with those organizations as well to be able to share that data. So we may have something a bit later on.
If you have specific questions about that, feel free to contact us at info@asianaustralianalliance.net about your specific query. And if we don't have the information, we'll be able to get to direct you to an organization that does collect that information. And before we move on quickly, Russell, Telly, and Ellen, do you do any segmented sort of reporting based on ethnic groups, based on your campaigns?
We haven't seen Asians attacking other Asians. Actually, what I've noticed is that this has been a moment of pan-Asian solidarity, and because people are racially profiling East Asians, at least as a whole, groups are really coming together. And a lot of our efforts have been led by South Asian leadership. And so that's been, for us in our particular context, really heartening. We're actually really trying to learn from Muslim, South Asian, and Arab brothers and sisters how they dealt with the aftermath of 9/11, because again, we see the same trends of racism and racist policies being enacted after the attack in 9/11. And so the wisdom and strategy from those leaders have really helped us organize at this moment.
From the Canadian perspective, I would echo what Russell just said. We had kind of two phases of our survey or report incident form. So in the first iteration, we were not collecting any details about ethnicities or backgrounds, but we were seeing from the results of our first phase, we're showing that most people were experiencing these incidents in public spaces where there were witnesses. So since we've expanded the form, so people are able to share more detailed information about the ethnicities of people who are enacting the violence, the ethnicities of any witnesses that are watching. So we will continue to collect that information, and hopefully we haven't got to the analysis of that yet, but that's the next step.
Fantastic, thank you so much. So we've started to touch on the influence of media and social media, and how that's driven or exacerbated racist rhetoric, particularly in the United States, where Trump has been very vocal about his opinions of COVID-19, its sources, and whatnot, even very, very recently in the debate. So I think one thing that's been common to all of our campaigns is the concerted media and social media strategies that have been employed to address this issue. I think what would be useful for everyone joining us today is a brief chat about what's been done and what wins we've had in our particular campaigns. Perhaps I can get Osmond and Telly to kick us off in that discussion.
Yep, I'm happy to start. I thought I'd just make a few observations just based on our experience in Australia. I think that what really helped was in getting, it's kind of this double-edged sword where the sheer fact that there were no official statistics from police, the Human Rights Commission at a real national level meant that what we produced was newsworthy, and essentially became the evidence that was cited by people when they wanted to talk about anti-Asian racism related to COVID. And it really helped that we actually had numbers we could use. Unfortunately, unless you can quantify something into a number, it's often not taken seriously. It's treated as anecdotal. But at the same time, while the statistics were the hook, what really had the impact was the stories. So you'd have a newspaper headline saying, 400 incidents, but what they talked about were the particular incidents that we asked people to describe. So being harassed in the street, what happened to their family, and so forth. Social media, I think, played a huge role in building the survey and getting the word out there. We used it heavily to publicize it, and I think it was really what led to the snowball effect where we actually got people to fill it out. And I don't think we could have done it without social media, really using it as a megaphone amongst the progressive base to really publicize it and encourage people to fill out the survey. But while I think social media played an important role, what really made a difference was legacy media. And I think that they're kind of related. And we were able to use legacy media to really elevate the issue. So Australia is a pretty concentrated media market. So, we only have a few major cities and most of them are one-paper towns. And we only have about 2 real big media conglomerates. But we were able to get a coverage in pretty much all the non-News Corporation media. So the 9 papers in Sydney and Melbourne, so the main broadsheets, The Guardian, the ABC, which is our equivalent of the BBC, and SBS. And it was almost like a cycle where, as a result of getting legacy media coverage, we actually got more people filling out our survey. I guess in terms of what didn't work, and I think this just highlights the importance of timing in the broader context to get traction beyond our base. So just as an example, we recently released some polling we got Essential Media to do, and that didn't get as much media coverage as some of our previous work. We only got coverage in SBS and I think 1 or 2 other places, as opposed to those other media outlets that covered our previous work. And I think that really highlights that timing matters. So in the month where we got a lot of traction, part of the reason was because China had accused Australia of being an unsafe place for people of Asian heritage to visit. So I think that geopolitical element meant that what we had to say was very relevant to the media, particularly as the government pushed back to claim that this wasn't the case. So in many ways, our survey was highlighted to say, oh no, actually there is racism in Australia. Look at this survey, which had hundreds of people filling it out. So that's probably my observations from our experience here.
Thank you, Osmond. The people who are joining us from Australia, you would have seen that many stories that were collected from our survey were actually circulated, as Osmond mentioned, on legacy media. And that's really where we got traction on our survey. So if you're interested, definitely drop us a line or take a look at the website to see links to those stories. Osmond, was there one particular story that stood out for you in the media on the back of this?
Do you mean as in what got real attention, or I mean there wasn't really. I think one thing we did do is we kind of did a bit of a drip feed. So we tried to keep the story going, and I think that sort of built momentum after a while. So every few weeks, releasing some more data, saying, there's more reports, or trying to do something, for example, in between some of our initial reports and the preliminary report we released. I think we did a media release saying there were a few more, like 100 or 200 more reports, but we also used the Stop AAPI HATE survey as a comparison, saying, per capita compared to the US, these are how many reports we've received, to try to give it a fresh angle. And I think it was building up that momentum to keep it in the public eye, to keep stoking it until the right time came about. And you can't control it, but I think that's what really meant that we could eventually get huge cut through.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember when we released results and started pointing to the international experience and pointing out that the stories that were coming out from overseas were not unique to those contexts, that they were actually happening also here in Australia. And I think it's been useful across the ocean as well. Telly, could you speak to that in the American context and what's been happening there in the media and social media?
Yeah, for our campaign, Watch the Hate, what sparked that campaign was actually a social media video, and it was a viral video that showed an Asian man being harassed on the New York City subway. He's being verbally harassed and sprayed with Febreze and being accused of spreading the virus. And from that point on, my team and I decided we needed to do something. And what we did was we wanted to do something that sort of demonstrated Asian American solidarity with the greater community in a time of crisis. But during that time, lockdown orders were being announced, social distancing restrictions were happening. So we realized the only thing we could really do is a social media campaign. So we partnered with influencers and Asian American celebrities, and we had them make videos of themselves washing their hands and sharing a personal story about how COVID has impacted their lives. So we launched with that. It got some great traction. We were one of the early US-based hashtag campaigns to go out there with this message. And ironically, or coincidentally, we launched our campaign the same day that President Trump doubled down on his Chinese virus comments on March 17th. So that gave us a great deal of traction, and that led to an enormous amount of media coverage. So we were covered also in the legacy media, digital media, but we also continued our social media strategy, and then we eventually snowballed into producing a public service announcement that aired on various channels. And that was always the hope of our campaign, was to raise awareness in different quarters of the US population. And we know that these days in the US, 62% of people get their news, 62% of adults get their news from social media. So it's a very fragmented media market, and we realized that we couldn't just rely on one channel. So when we did social media, we were able to reach the millennials and Gen Z. When we did PR for the campaign, we were able to reach Gen Xers. And when we did broadcast for our PSA, we were getting, boomers emailing us and telling us, non-Asian emailing us and telling us they didn't know that this was a problem in the community. So it's always surprising, and it's very easy to sort of insulate yourself from things going on in the world these days. So I think our omni-channel strategy for our campaign worked fairly well, and we were able to really. And I think the thing that really surprised us and delighted us about the campaign was the amount of allyship that we received outside the Asian American community early on. So CEOs and executive leaders from organizations from like Walmart to Nielsen to Panda Express coming on board and really demonstrating solidarity. And I think a lot of that, hopefully that goodwill was also something that was reflected in the amount of participation from young Asian Americans after the killing of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter protests as well.
Fantastic. And for anybody who doesn't have context on the campaign, what kind of channels did you employ, and which one was the most successful?
Oh, wow. We started with social media and creating a website. And I think on Instagram, we got a lot of traction, as well as Twitter. And then the PSA that Comcast came in and gave us $500,000 of media airtime. That also reached a large number of people in small cities across the US. So I think that I can't point to one specific channel, because also the earned media we received also reached a whole different audience. So I think when you're putting together a campaign like this or an initiative like this, you really have to pull all the different levers because you're going to reach completely different people on each turn.
Sure. Russell, Melina, Ellen, is there anything you'd like to add on the back of that?
I'd just like to quickly add, I talked about how history repeated itself after 9/11. We didn't have social media after 9/11, and we also didn't have a president who incited racism. And so we've seen how social media circulates racist tweets, and there was a big uptick in the use of the term Chinese virus after Trump used it, and again, that gave people the association and racialized the virus, that the virus is Chinese and Chinese people have the virus. And then the introduction of that hate speech then led to hate violence. So social media has made an enormous impact. And what we've seen globally is, again, you see that offensive meme or post of Chinese people eating bats. That went viral. And that's why we're getting, when people attack us, they use language like, "Go home, you bat eater." And so the impact of social media and hate speech has really made racists a lot more viral, at least in the United States, and I think goes globally. And that's why efforts like Telly's and Wash the Hate were really instrumental in resisting. that just as much as politicians and white supremacists use social media, I think Asian Americans have been really creators of resistance and creating their own content that sort of challenges a lot of the stereotypes. So that's been a big site of resistance is social media. In terms of media, what we found, and we've gotten a lot of coverage, we actually have paid media consultants who work with us, is that we have all our reports ready to go. And then when someone actually experiences a racist incident that gets video captured, right? They capture it on their smartphone. Then when you couple footage of a racist incident backed up by, documentation of thousands of like incidents, that's been powerful. And that's how we've gotten a lot of coverage, sadly. So if someone gets sprayed, if someone gets insulted at a restaurant, that coupled with a report, and if the person's willing to speak, gets a lot of coverage in the US.
I'll just add that I saw a new study that came out in Sage Journals. It's about racially charged coronavirus coverage and trends in bias against Asian Americans. And some of the metrics were pretty stunning. So I'll just read two here. On March 8th, there was a 650% increase in Twitter retweets using the term Chinese virus and related terms. And the following day, on March 9th, there was an 800% increase in the use of those terms in conservative news media articles. So I think that there really speaks to the power of social media and the harms it can have.
Yeah, actually, yeah, and to bounce on that, one extra data point, UCLA did a really good random sample survey based on health, and they asked about racial bias experiences. And 5.4% of Californian Asian Americans reported directly experiencing racism. So 5.4% doesn't sound like many, but there are so many Asians in California. We make up 15% of the population. That's over 260,000 incidents of racism. And it's over 6 months. That's over 1,000 a day that in California alone. So our reporting sites are underreported. Like was said, it's just the tip of the iceberg. And we really think government should be actually creating these reporting sites. Government should be accountable for dealing with racism, not our small community agencies and alliances. And but again, because government wasn't being accountable, we had to create our own reporting centers to document and then to show that these aren't isolated incidents, like was said.
Thank you, Russell. I think that's true of many of our contexts, that there is a severe gap in the reporting mechanisms in each of our countries, at least not a systematic, centralized place to be able to report these incidents and the varied nature of the racism that is experienced, and also the diversity to which the racism is being perpetrated to. And I think what's been really important in our campaigns is that we are shedding light on this and making a concerted effort to collate that data in a meaningful way and share it across the world to our partners to show that this is something systematic that is happening to the diaspora. In the interest of time, because we only have 5 minutes left and there's still so much to talk about, a lot of people have been putting questions through about collaboration. What can we do next? What more can we do? And we touched a little bit on that in being able to harness traditional media and social media in different ways and the importance of that. But what is the future of your campaigns? What are the next steps? What are the necessary things we need to do next to make sure that we facilitate that necessary collaboration and encourage that sense of solidarity between Asianx in the different diasporas? So put that open to the panel.
I can start quickly. Stop AAPI Hate, we're really looking for policy interventions. And so our data gives us really helpful information about where we should direct policy, to whom. For example, a lot of incidents occur in schools with youth bullying. And so we've been working with our superintendent of schools to promote ethnic studies. And ethnic studies includes anti-racist curriculum that deals at the sort of the source of racism. I talked about how a lot of our incidents are civil rights violations, that even the verbal harassment that goes on at stores, those constitute discrimination because Asians aren't getting safe access to goods and services because of the harassment, whether it's from a fellow customer or whether it's from an employee of that store. So if you're covered by civil rights legislation, you can file a complaint to the government saying, you know, I didn't get safe access, I didn't get public accommodations, and then government is required to respond. So we're actually, rather than pursuing a lot of hate crime enforcement, which criminalizes communities of color, we're pushing for civil suits and looking for impact cases where, let's say, at a corporate retailer isn't providing protection for Asian customers. We think that's more effective because it doesn't sort of, you know, again, criminalize the individual, but tries to deal on a systematic level and hold corporations accountable for keeping Asians safe. You know, we have signage that says keep physically distance. I think corporations could put up signage saying treat your fellow customer respectfully. And so we're doing both more public education policy work, more ethnic studies, and more of the civil rights approach rather than a hate crime enforcement, which is really limited.
I can talk about our Victorian Australian campaign. So I think just generally, I think racism is a systemic issue. Generally, we need more work to be done to normalize inclusion. I think in Australia, usually with diversity, we always talk about gender diversity, and other strands of diversity are largely ignored, particularly cultural diversity. So I think the focus needs to shift in our general rhetoric as well on what diversity actually means. I think we can learn from the work in the US and Canada, and that's where collaborating with organizations and groups like that are represented today is really important for us. We want to keep our survey open and compare the results as we go forward as well. And as I mentioned before, we've got the South Asian campaign. And then we had quite a few recommendations coming out from our report as well, which we presented as part of our report earlier in July. So the findings, so some of the recommendations were for government action, and those were that the Commonwealth government should spearhead the new national anti-racism strategy to improve community understanding of what constitutes racism, why it is a problem, and ways to prevent it and reduce its prevalence, and education about avenues to report. Recently, we also collaborated with the Victorian Human Rights and Equal Opportunities Commission and the Victorian Multicultural Commission to provide some information sessions for community leaders from different ethnic communities about where they can, giving them information about where they can report and who to report to, and what the outcomes can be. So the information piece is really important. Then the police, relevant state anti-discriminatory bodies, and the Australian Human Rights Commission should work together to improve data collection on racially motivated incidents and enable nationally consistent data on incidents of racism. This is something that is lacking, and we've touched on this before, that data, consistent national data is just not available. Then this, we also wanted to be coupled with better cultural sensitivity training for police and greater investment in multicultural and community liaison work. Then the creation of a one-stop shop to simplify the process of reporting for those who have experienced racism, as well as creation of a simple multilingual reporting avenues to facilitate reporting of incidents for those for whom English is not the first language. Services should not just be mere translations from English, but adapted and contextualized to the various CALD community needs. This may involve the creation of specific language offices, which can be the bridge for those communities in accessing government services in general. Then removal of legislative barriers to prosecution for racially motivated criminal actions, and the strengthening of anti-vilification laws. Russell touched upon that anti-vilification aspect of it, but it's very difficult to prove anti-vilification vilification here, so that's something that we need to that needs to be looked at by the government as well. This is already in train in Victoria, and we are part of the campaign. We also recommended some media related step that can be taken. So the Australian Human Rights Commission should work with organizations such as the Australian Press Council to develop advisory guidelines for removing unconscious bias in reporting on Asia and Asian-related Asian Australian communities. This will assist newsrooms and media professionals in understanding how such bias can inadvertently flame anti-Asian sentiments and the reasons why. Social media platforms should make it easier to report and remove trending content that is confirmed as false that may encourage COVID-19 related anti-Asian racism. Individuals who share removed content should be directly informed by platforms that the content was verified as false. There were some two other recommendations. One was to strengthen the work on promoting human rights among the temporary residents, including international students, because in Australia, that's a massive part of our population. Reference to the principles to protect the human rights of international students, and then involvement of multicultural community leaders, civil rights organizations, student bodies, and other stakeholders in developing strategies against racial discrimination. This also includes bystander intervention training. So I think these are some of the recommendations coming out from our report through what we saw in our report. And it would be good to hear what Canada is doing as well.
Thank you, Melina.
Wow, that was a very extensive list. I'm very impressed.
It's a wish list. It's a wish list.
Wish list.
Yes, I would say, yeah, I would echo many of the things that were already listed. I do feel that we're a bit behind in Canada. Our country does a very bad job of collecting data, and this allows us to maintain plausible deniability across, all boards. So right now, we're a very young project. We're less than a year old, completely volunteer run. Right now, we're just really committed to continuing to collect data to demonstrate what is really happening in our communities and to start to get anti-Asian racism into the discourse, into social discourse. So in Canada, for example, the National Anti-Racism Strategy that was released recently doesn't mention anti-Asian racism, anti-Asian sentiment whatsoever. It does include other terms such as anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and anti-Black racism, but it's not in the conversation yet. So this is something that we're really pushing for people to recognize that this is actually happening in our communities. I think it's also really important that we need to pivot and look at how we can support our communities that have experienced this trauma. There's so many people that are still living in fear or are suffering in silence over what they've experienced. I would like to see more mental health supports, more support groups, more culturally appropriate, accessible. We already spoke about language, but all of these things need to happen for our communities, and we need resources behind them. So, we already talked about centralized reporting systems, about adapted and contextualized, appropriately translated resources. All of these things are things we're also calling for. And we've also called on the federal government to include an anti-racism strategy in its post-pandemic recovery plan. The pandemic has impacted people disproportionately. So what are we doing to make sure that equity is at the center of when we move forward and when we recover from COVID-19? And then I think we need to turn inwards, and there's a lot of work that we need to do within the community, and we need to work on our organizing. In Canada, we're pretty young and our organizations are young. There's not a lot of work that's happening across the country. So the recent report that we just released with a number of organizations, the Chinese Canadian National Council, the Toronto chapter, the Social Justice chapter, and then the Vancouver Asian Film Festival, that was the first national release of data on racism. So we need to continue to build these bridges, build a broader, more unified, coordinated voice. We can't even collectively decide on what we want to be called. I know in the US, AAPI, for example, is a standard term. People say Asian Canadian, but a lot of people don't even identify with that. So there's a lot of work that we need to do internally as well.
Thank you, Ellen. Osmond, Telly, was there anything you wanted to add before we wrap up?
I think the only thing I wanted to add is I think one of the challenges that we face is that this issue of racism is very much seen through an ideological prism, and often it's in a culture war sense, that because if there's not explicit discrimination, legalistic forms of discrimination, or there's no malicious intent, or there's no physical violence, it doesn't really exist, and it's a figment of people's imagination, and is just used to essentially attack the nation states. I think that's one of the challenges we face, that people think that it's not real, and we just need to be aware of that, because I think that can often be a barrier to getting people who may not share our political worldview to even acknowledge that it's a problem.
Yeah, for Watch the Hate, we're in the process of working on a new PSA that's hopefully going to approach this issue with a new lens and continue the conversation about racism in the US.
I think Ellen very rightly pointed about mental health as well, which I just wanted to add that we are working on a project hopefully with the Victorian Human Rights and Equal Opportunities Commission here in Victoria about in relation to racism, COVID-19 related racism and the mental health issues that arise due to that, and running some sessions perhaps with people who have experienced that. So that's something in train and hopefully can be taken at the national level as well.
Absolutely. So that's all the time that we have. We've run a little bit over time, apologies, but there was so much to get through and still so much to say and so much to do. I think that we're just at the tip of the iceberg here in the kinds of campaigns that we can and should be running. I think that this is the first step in a fantastic global collaboration, as all of our panelists said tonight or this morning, that core to this is allyship and solidarity, not just in our countries, but across the world in the different diasporas, because we do have the shared experience of COVID-related or COVID-fueled racism to our communities. And it's really, really important for us to stay connected, to support each other. Ellen and Melina spoke about mental health and how important it is for our communities to support each other sort of socially, but also in the development of resources and tools that we can employ in our respective communities. One thing that has developed as a result of our collaborations is some new training in anti-racism by our partners in Democracy in Colour. So definitely go out and check that out. If there's any other burning questions that you have, please email us at info@asianaustralianalliance.net. I will just post that in the comments now. I know that there were a lot of questions that we didn't get to, but we'll certainly pass it on to our panelists so you can get a response. And if you do want to collaborate with any of the panelists here, we're going to have a continued dialogue into what's happening in our respective communities, what the changing tide is in social and political spheres, how that affects our different diasporas, and also what kinds of segments we should be looking at moving forward, if that's meaningful, that comes out of our data. So if one of our admins could repost our reporting tool, and perhaps the reporting tools of any of our partners. As we mentioned, we're still collecting data, we're still taking the pulse on what's happening around the world in response to different influences. But otherwise, thank you so much for joining us. If we could, I know that we can't see you, but if you could go to the comment box and maybe say thank you or clap or something to acknowledge our panelists today, and hopefully we can all stay in touch. Thank you and good morning or good night. Have a lovely weekend, long weekend for anybody in Australia joining us. So again, the email address to stay in contact is info@asianaustralianalliance.net, and hope that you join us for a future collaboration. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Idri. Thanks, everyone. I think we can email some of those links that people have asked for to everyone who's registered. That might
Absolutely.
help.
So if
Yeah.
there's any further questions or any resources you'd like to share, we can do a follow-up email with all of that included.
Thanks to all our partners as well for this event. It's been great.
Yes.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, everybody, for joining. Thank you.
Thanks for organizing.
Yeah.
Okay, bye.
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 Bye.